Hello and welcome to another episode of the It Depends podcast. As always, I am your host. My name is Kevin Goldsmith, and I am the author of It Depends, writing on technology leadership 2012 to 2022. And I'm also a CTO. I've been a VP of engineering. I've been a director of engineering. I've been working in the software industry for over 30 years now. This book captures 10 years of my career, but it captures a pretty important time. It's where I went from senior engineering manager to director to VP to CTO, and then to my second CTO job. So it actually covers a lot of my growth, and I share a lot of the lessons I learned along the way. In this podcast, I share chapters from the audiobook, and I'm sharing them in order. So if you go back to episode 1, you get chapter 1, and so on and so forth. And there's also a newsletter. The newsletter is serializing the text of the book, but it serializes it out of order. As this is a collection of articles I've written, the order isn't so critical except for a few places where it's a series, and in those cases, I run the newsletter in series. The newsletter publishes on the weeks that the podcast doesn't. So this week podcast, next week newsletter. This week we are covering chapter 17 from the book, Addressing the Challenges of Partially Distributed Engineering Teams. And I published this originally on May 17th of 2021. It was a talk I was giving at various conferences prior to COVID. And in fact, I'm pretty sure it was the last talk I gave before everything started shutting down. I gave it at the Craft conference in Budapest in, I think, 2020, maybe 2019. I don't remember exactly. It's on my website. In the show notes, I will actually include a link to that talk and to the slides so you can see that as well. But when I rewrote this into article form, it covers some of the same things, but it covers some other things too. So those links will be in the show notes to the original talk. I wrote the talk before COVID, so it was still in a world where companies were generally either in an office or not in an office, or some combination of the two. And I talk about these various shades on the spectrum, the spectrum from fully distributed versus fully co-located. I don't particularly like the word remote because it very much implies that you are either in one place or you are remote from that place. Even prior to COVID, when I had worked in companies that were partially distributed, I worked in an office. I just didn't work in an office at the HQ, but the company that I worked at for 9 years was Adobe, and Adobe had offices, multiple offices. I worked in the Seattle office. I worked with people in the San Jose office. There was also a big office. There still is a big office in San Francisco, big office in Noida, big office in Bangalore after we bought Macromedia, offices in Minnesota. So there were offices everywhere and people were working in offices. But there were, of course, also a few individuals that worked fully remote, and they called it remote. And they were remote from an office, so maybe that was more appropriate. But when we would talk about how the situation worked, it was like, well, San Jose was the corporate headquarters, so everybody else was sort of in another office, but you would be kind of remote. That was sort of a different world prior to COVID. Since COVID, I haven't worked in an office since. When we started shutting down, I was working for a company in London. We were fully in an office. We had multiple offices. We did also have individuals that were remote, but mostly, certainly the engineering team was in one of two offices. So for us, we went through that whole process of moving to remote and having to deal with all of that. And then also, we were London-based, but we had a lot of folks from Europe, and folks started going home. And I came back to the US, and it got to be this kind of classic problem. But I went to go work for another company that had been primarily in an office, but also had individuals, and then went fully remote. And I wrote this article after that experience. So it has a little bit more of that kind of understanding of having gone from, like a lot of people, fully co-located or partially co-located to fully distributed, and just the problems around that. So I try and cover all these things because I do think, and in my own experience, having worked fully co-located works great, right? Everybody in the same office, that, people may not prefer it, but as far as working together and getting stuff done, it works great. Totally great. I have, first, like many of us, for several years now, I've worked in a fully distributed company. And in fact, the company I work at now, unlike a lot of post-COVID companies, has always been fully distributed. So company's 10 years old, never may have had an office, but nobody worked there, right? So it's always been fully distributed. People work all over the world, and it has been built that way. My own experience, having worked in a company that had been in an office primarily and kind of had an office culture and moved to being fully distributed, my experience working in a partially distributed company like Adobe, where there's people in offices working together, just not in the same building or city, but both in offices. And also my experience working in a fully co-located company like Microsoft or other places I've worked. So my experience with all these kinds of things inform me. And one of the things I talk a lot about is, fully co-located works great. I now know fully distributed works great as well, right? There are some things you have to do differently. There's trade-offs you make. Absolutely. But me as a leader, absolutely love having access to talent wherever that talent is, and not having to either find the talent in a specific place or convince someone to move to be in that place to come work with us. I love not having to deal with that. I also, as a person, like not having to get up super early to commute to an office. It saves me literally 2-3 hours out of my day. And that's time I can spend working if I want to, or being with my family, walking the dog, not leaving when it's dark, getting home when it's dark, which I've had to do in various companies over the years. So I appreciate that. But I also understand we have challenges. We have challenges that a fully co-located company doesn't have. And I talk about that in this chapter. The other thing I talk about is that in between, that partially distributed. So my experience at Adobe, and by the way, Adobe does this well. I don't shame former employers, so I'm not trying to shame or toss shade at Adobe here. I worked at Adobe for 9 years. It was a great place to work. I worked with people in multiple offices. Adobe was pretty good at making that work while I was there. And it was kind of expected. And it also meant that even if you worked in Minnesota or New York or San Francisco and you had career mobility, you could join a team that was based in Seattle or San Jose. And the company kind of made that work, which was pretty cool. That said, having experienced sort of pretty much every stage on this continuum of fully distributed and fully co-located, that partially distributed, absolutely the worst. The absolute worst of that. Adobe did a great job making it work. Still wasn't as good as either my experience in multiple companies, fully distributed or fully co-located. And I talk a lot about that because there are a lot of companies doing that now, especially post-COVID, where you'll have, you need to be in the office 2 days a week, or you need to be in the office 3 days a week. Or, some people are going to stay fully distributed and they're going to take trade-offs or whatever, and other people are going to be back in the office. Or you've moved to this other city, you're going to work from that office, but you're going to keep working with your team in the city you left. It's tough. It's the toughest. And it's the toughest for what I talk about in the chapter and expand upon is communication bandwidth, meaning my experience in that environment was I led an organization where we had people in Seattle, where I was based, people in Minnesota, people in San Jose, and people in San Francisco, and also a few individuals working from their homes. So we had this problem because we had little groups of people in all these places. And what happens is if you're working in office with somebody else, you're going to talk a lot more because you're going to bump into each other in the coffee room. You're going to go to lunch together. If you have a question, it's a lot easier to knock on somebody's door or walk over to their cubicle or stop by their desk than it is to send a Slack message to somebody and ask them if they have a minute or set up a video conference. That's natural. That's human. What ends up happening is you have these little pockets of high density communication, people talking to each other all the time. And then very low density communication, which is the people in Minnesota don't talk as often to the people in Seattle because people in Minnesota can talk to each other, people in Seattle can talk to each other. And what they end up doing, even if they're working together, they tend to sync with each other as opposed to actually talk. Now, in an office, that doesn't happen because everybody can just talk to everybody. Fully distributed doesn't happen because everybody's on the same playing field. So pinging me, if you have a question, is no different than pinging anybody else in the company. We're all in the same kind of situation. And both of those, the expectations are clear, the understanding is clear. That's why I don't think this partially distributed model works very well. And my own experience is you can make it work because we did, but that isn't the same thing as saying it's really efficient. And in fact, I will tell you, I never had to travel so much for work as I did when I worked in partially distributed companies, because I needed to, as a leader, I needed to make sure that I was getting FaceTime not only with my management and peers in other teams to make sure that we had high bandwidth communication, but also I felt a responsibility to have that same in-person time with people that worked for me in these different places, which meant that I had to make a point to go to these different offices to visit those teams. And that was great to see these people in person. It wasn't great on sort of work-life balance and things like that because I was having to travel all the time. And again, in a fully distributed company as I am now and like I have been in prior companies, do we travel to see each other in person? We absolutely do. Do we have to do it as much? No, we absolutely don't. Because, again, the natural mode of communication doesn't require it. We have equal amounts of communication to every node in the network. So I'm not constantly having to do this. And I talk about this meeting in person being an important thing, and it is. And by the way, it's super important for my teams today in a fully distributed organization, try and make sure we get a chance for them to be in person at least occasionally, because of something else I noticed. When you're interacting with your coworkers primarily through video, it tends to be very transactional. This is well discussed in lots of places. It tends to be very transactional because of just the nature of the communication. And you stop thinking of people as people and you start thinking of them as what I say is pixels on a screen. They're not actually people. They're sort of video images that aren't connected to humans with real lives and interests and your coworkers that you like, hopefully, and want to know more about. So partially the point of bringing people together in person on as regular basis as you can is to remind everybody, hey, we're human, because that tends to make it easier for people to extend grace to their peers, to be nice to them, to give them the benefit of the doubt. When we don't interact with each other as humans for long periods of time and start to think of each other as kind of abstracts, we stop giving each other the benefit of the doubt, some grace, some understanding. We lose empathy for each other. And the way I first really understood this was I was managing a team that was half in Seattle and half in San Jose. And I live in Seattle. And so we would have meetings, team meetings, where we'd be in a conference room in Seattle, and then the other part of the team would be in a conference room in San Jose, and we'd be talking. And it was almost like clockwork. Somewhere in there, somebody in San Jose would propose something, somebody in Seattle would say, well, you people in corporate, that makes sense to you, or something like that. Or somebody in San Jose would say, well, you people in Seattle, that must be what you're thinking. And the minute I heard that phrase, and it really was like clockwork, like every about 3 months, I would hear this phrase from one or the other, and I go, oh, waited too long, time to get everybody back together. And we would schedule a meeting. We'd alternate between the two offices. Folks from California would come up to Seattle. Folks from Seattle would go to California. And we'd just do that to put everybody in the same place for a day or two, get a meal or get a few meals together, do some work, maybe do a fun thing where we could interact with humans again. And then everybody goes home. And then that would get us about 3 months working well together, and people being people. This person, you're not this pixels on the screen. Oh, you're my pal. And remember when we had that dinner and you accidentally ate that spicy pepper? That was hilarious, right? That gives you that grace. That gives you the benefit of doubt when that person that you saw eat the spicy pepper proposes an idea, a technical architecture decision that you think is ridiculous. Maybe you go, well, I know them. Maybe it isn't ridiculous. Maybe it's just, maybe I didn't understand what they really meant. And you ask the clarifying question instead of saying, that's dumb, or I don't know why you think that would work, right? That's why we have to do this. And that's why we have to adjust our communication. I talk about moving to primarily offline communication, especially if your team is spread across a lot of time zones. I learned that lesson from Automatic. Automatic does a great job of documenting how they manage a fully distributed team spread over a bunch of time zones over a bunch of years. I'll give credit to Atlassian. Atlassian does something very similar. You can find companies that do this well, that talk about it. And you should look at what they've done and learn from it if you're in this situation. But today I have a team that goes all the way from Perth, Australia to Cyprus and Israel, which means it's pretty hard to find time for everybody to talk together at a convenient time for all of them. And if we hold a company meeting, it's hard to find that at a time that is convenient for everyone. So moving to try and do more things kind of offline and do more things asynchronously is absolutely critical, but it's critical anyway if you're in a distributed team, because not just across time zones, but other stuff's coming up. Somebody's got a dentist appointment, somebody's got this, somebody's got that. Something to think about with this is there's a little cringe here where I'm writing in May 2021 saying, hey, COVID's almost over, which of course it wasn't. But it was starting to feel that way. You're starting to see lots more articles about people coming back to the office and that kind of thing. Really, it was at least another year, more. So I apologize for that. A lot of people were thinking that back then. If you hear all this language about, oh, people are starting to talk about coming back into the office, that was still very much in the middle of COVID, but it was starting to feel like maybe we had an end in sight there. So caveat that one. A lot of the lessons I tried to convey in this chapter, a lot of things I've learned predated COVID. I've certainly learned a ton more since that time, and I try and include that in this as well. So here now is addressing the challenges of partially distributed engineering team. Addressing the Challenges of Partially Distributed Engineering Teams. Originally published on May 17, 2021. As companies begin planning their approach to post-pandemic life, patterns are starting to emerge. Some companies are planning to return to their offices and carry on as they did before. Others are adopting a partially distributed structure, reopening some of their offices, but not assigning desks or requiring employees to work there. Some companies have even switched to being fully distributed. In a fully co-located team, every member is in the same office near each other, nearly every day. A fully distributed team has every member in a different physical location almost every day. Everything else is partially co-located, partially distributed, or hybrid. Even if you all work in the same physical office, if people are there on different days, you are only partially co-located. The tech industry has consistently demonstrated creativity and innovation in how work is structured. Companies like Automatic, GitLab, and others have long shared lessons on how fully distributed teams can be effective. Decades of business books have addressed the challenges of leadership in co-located teams, but there isn't as much published wisdom on leading partially distributed teams beyond the suggestion of treating them as fully distributed. I have led fully co-located teams, fully distributed teams, and partially distributed teams. I've always said that the partially distributed is the hardest to do well. The problems with being partially distributed. Inconsistent communication speeds. The most significant problem with being partially co-located is that you quickly fall into asymmetric communication patterns. Folks in the same physical locations have very high bandwidth conversations, but everyone else communicates at a fraction of the efficiency. The bandwidth issue extends beyond group meetings, where some are in a conference room and others are on video, and permeates spontaneous meetings too. People talking at the coffee machine, at lunch, or bumping into each other in the hall. People are more inclined to call out to a colleague they can physically see rather than trying to reach one over chat or video. These spontaneous conversations might inspire solutions to team challenges that don't involve the larger group, creating friction. The team can splinter as the people who follow similar schedules end up working together more frequently. Distrust builds within the team, especially if some are in other cities or have other commitments preventing them from being present when their peers are. Parts of the group may feel isolated or left out of the decision-making process. This inconsistent communication bandwidth can significantly impact the design of the team's deliverables due to the effects of Conway's law. Any organization that designs a system, defined broadly, will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. Unequal visibility of work. People naturally have a recency bias, tending to prefer recent events over historical ones. They also have more of a personal connection with those they interact with in person over those on a video call, a familiarity bias. Both biases work against those who are physically present less often. The lack of direct visibility of you or your team relative to other groups can be a significant disadvantage for you, the team, or individuals when it is time for performance reviews or recognition. Even if the team members have worked hard to achieve a goal, if they were not literally visible and other individuals were, you will have to overcome those biases to justify raises or promotions. Inconsistent working hours. If your team is spread over many time zones, you get the classic problem of people having to wait on others when they need assistance, clarification, or to hand off work. This problem can also happen with teams in near time zones if part of the team works from home or better incorporate their outside of work responsibilities or have a more flexible schedule. Unless addressed through restructuring the way work flows or introducing other constraints, work stalls in the team and people get frustrated. Addressing the challenges. Create consistent expectations of availability. If most of the team plans to work 2 or 3 days in the office each week, have the team agree on which days that will be, so that when the group is in the office, most of the people are there. If people need to accommodate their time zone or outside of work commitments, mutually agree on shared working hours. During those times, people are expected to be online and available for discussions or questions. Those hours do not need to be contiguous. Ensure that people on the team are proactively communicating their availability so that others know when they can reach out or expect faster responses. It may be helpful to have a shared team calendar where every member puts their expected working hours for the week and adjust that calendar if something comes up. If possible, avoid being partially distributed. If nearly everyone on your team plans to return to the office, it might make sense for the people who plan to work off-site to switch to a mainly distributed team and vice versa. It may seem extreme to suggest that people switch to another group, but it will make things easier for them and for their teams to be fully distributed or fully co-located. Make sure that your team is visible. The adage, out of sight, out of mind, speaks to a truth about human nature. Suppose your organization's leadership is working from the office, and you or members of your team are primarily working from other locations. In that case, it is vital to make sure that the individuals and team's work is visible. Invite your manager to your virtual team demos or ask them to stop by your team meeting or stand-up. Proactively tell your boss when individuals exceed your expectations. Invite your manager to set up occasional skip-level meetings with the distributed people in the group. If your boss has office hours, encourage members of your team to attend from time to time. These strategies to increase visibility are helpful even for entirely co-located organizations, but they are crucial for partially distributed teams. Take opportunities to build empathy. Video meetings can become very transactional, especially when it seems like the workday is full of them. Without the spontaneous conversations and connections that arise from chance meetings in an office, you can start to forget that the people on your team are actual humans and not just pixels on a screen. Take time in your meetings for small talk and don't feel like you have to force people immediately back to the agenda if the team digresses into talking about their favorite TV shows or places they want to visit. These human details remind everyone that their coworkers are people with lives and emotions. It encourages empathy. When the whole team can travel safely and without concern, bring them together on a regular cadence, the frequency determined by the travel budget and people's freedom to travel. Spending time with each other will encourage much more profound empathy between the people on the team. Move communication offline as much as possible. Co-located teams avoid many meetings by stopping by each other's desks for a 5-minute chat. When you can't see the person, a very natural thing to do is to book a 30-minute meeting for that conversation instead, and invite several others who might have input while you're at it, thus guaranteeing that it will use all 30 minutes and may run over. Fully distributed teams have long favored written communication as the primary tool to document decision-making and be more inclusive of colleagues spread across time zones. This model was also pioneered and perfected by large open-source projects where wide geographic distribution is the norm. Enforcing an offline-first communication and decision-making process within your team helps ameliorate the challenges of non-overlapping work schedules and brings increased symmetry to the communication speeds. Take a remote-first approach to team meetings. As I mentioned above, a common suggestion for partially co-located teams is to have everyone dial into group meetings even if they are sitting near each other. Treating all as if they are distributed helps put everyone on an equal footing in the discussion. Still, it is not always possible if there are no adequate facilities in the office to support that. Alternatives would be to have whoever leads the meeting always dial in from another location or have the bulk of team meetings on days when the group has decided to work from home. We're not done changing. This is an opportunity. Just over a year ago, most companies were comfortable with their ways of working or were evolving them slowly, but the pandemic forced all companies to adjust new ways of operating immediately. Finding a new normal will be a much more gradual process with much uncertainty. As an engineering leader, there's a massive opportunity to find new ways for your team to be effective in this new world of work. You and the group should approach the challenge with flexibility and a willingness to experiment. Share the ideas you learn with your peers in the larger organization. If companies struggle to make this new flexibility and work successful, they will quickly move back to their old ways of doing things. You can help your company be a leader in providing flexibility and freedom to its employees while also being effective at delivering value to your customers. When you figure things out, please share them with the rest of us. We're on this new normal journey together. I hope you enjoyed that chapter. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please share it. And I want to remind you again that it's coming up now. If you're hearing this when it's published, in a month's time, I'm speaking at the Leading Edge conference in New York City. And I haven't checked, I believe it's not sold out. You can, if that's the case, you can still use the code DistroKid, DISTROKID, to get 10% off. And that's my code that I'm giving to all of you. I will be there. I'm talking about the director to CTO path, how to mentor it or how to walk it. And very excited about this conference. I've talked about it a lot, so I won't bore you with it, but would love to see you if you attend the conference. Please come and say hi. And if you are interested in buying the book, go to itdependsbook.net. It depends book, all one word, .net. And there's links to all the various stores, so you can buy it in hardcover, softcover, ebook, audiobook. Links to most everything I found are available there. You can also order it from your local bookstore. It's available that way as well. Please, if you find value from the podcast, please do. I would appreciate it. If you have questions, if you have comments, please send me email, contact@itdependsbook.net. That's how you can reach me. There's links to this, links to the site in the show notes. If you're looking for that, if you can't remember it, you can find it there. If you like this podcast, please like it, please rate it, please share it. Whatever works for you, I would appreciate that very much. I will see you in the newsletter next week. I will see you back on this podcast in 2 weeks. Have a good week. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.